Ooh, look at that, we're recording. Hi, everybody. This is Lucas from Journey Beyond Travel. I'm here with Richard Hamilton today, one of my all-time favorite Morocco files. I, in fact, have reviewed both of his books. They're two of my favorite books on Morocco. You can find The Last Storytellers, The Tales from the Heart of Morocco, which is a collection of translated tales by oral storytellers on the Jemna Ifna and around Marrakesh. Very much a dying art. And this is how I first found out about Richard Hamilton and his kind of love for Morocco. And in many ways, this is a love letter to Morocco. And for anybody interested in the sort of classic form of storytelling that has existed here for literally 1,000 years and in the culture for thousands of years, it's what we do as a humanity, really. We tell stories to each other. We pass morals, we pass lessons, we pass history on this way. And I find it just a great, almost indispensable archive, of stories that may be lost quite soon. And then recently he's written Tangier, which is where I'm currently living right now. So Tangier, from the Romans to the Rolling Stones. Again, this is incredibly well researched, and it goes through thousands of years of this incredible history that we have here in Tangier, with all sorts of insights. And I would say mishaps as well. There's quite a few kind of mishaps along the way. And one of the nice things about Tangier, it's not just a dry history book. It's very much Richard's. It's in some ways again a sort of love letter for Tangier, but it's also his own misadventures and adventures in trying to uncover this history, which is very much still a bit mysterious, even for people who have been in Tangier for in their entire lifetime. So we're excited to talk to Richard today, both about Tangier, a little bit about The Last Storytellers. He also contributed to OUR Morocco, of course, our recent publication. All proceeds of that go to the Morocco Library Project. We'll link to that below, and we'll have a lot more information on that. So we'll touch on that today, and we'll get to know Richard a little bit and see where he's coming to us from. So let's welcome Richard to the conversation. Richard, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm very good. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Thank you so much. Where are you coming to us from? Where are you at right now?
So I'm living in West London, which is home for us. We've got 2 kids and a dog, and I work at the BBC in London. So during the pandemic, I've been cycling into work, which has kept my sanity, and just doing sort of normally family stuff the rest of the time. But it's been good, actually. We've got through all this, and London's beginning to open up a bit.
So it sounds like you're getting a little exercise. The kids aren't driving you too crazy, I hope.
No, well, the homeschooling was tough, but they're back at school, and in fact, I'm going for my first beer in a pub this evening with a friend that I took to Tangier in Morocco. So that will be nice to catch up. And in fact, I'm going to give him a copy of your book, because he loved the sound of it, and he sat in
our book.
Yeah,
it's our book. You're in there too. That's wonderful. Yeah, I did forget to mention. Of course, you are well-known BBC journalist. Definitely should have mentioned that as well. And yeah, also, do you want to talk a little bit about your role with the British Moroccan Society? Because I think that's maybe really interesting for our listeners and viewers here on YouTube to know about.
Yeah, so just on the BBC front, I was the BBC correspondent covering North Africa, but based in Rabat between 2006 and 2007, and that's how I came into contact with the storytellers in Marrakesh, and then that inspired that book. And around over that period, I was also interested in Tangier, so I started doing some reports about how Tangier was trying to sort of revive itself culturally. And at the time it was bidding to hold the World Expo or exposition, but it didn't win in the end. But they were sort of ramping up all their artistic and cultural venues and trying to put a lick of paint on everything. And so I was interested in the changes happening to the city and the British Moroccan Society. Yeah. So after I wrote my first book, I gave a talk about The Last Storytellers to the British Moroccan Society. And I thought, this is cool organization, and it's sort of 50-50 British and Moroccan people, and it's based in London, but they have trips to Morocco. We went to Tangier in 2016. They have cultural events. They have Moroccan evenings, meals, dancing, gala dinners, and all the money that they raise goes directly to small-scale charities in Morocco. And no, it's great. So I'm on the committee of it now, and I organise some of the cultural events. And one of the recent ones was you talking about OUR Morocco, which was fantastic. And again, I think people probably find Zoom a bit tiring, but it helped us get through the pandemic, which to connect with people from different parts of the world, talking about their love of Morocco. And so. But we are, the British Moroccan Society, we are looking forward to having more physical events and meeting up in real life, face to face.
Yeah, once we get out of this sort of pandemic and this very much virtual living, I think, I think there's going to be there's this pent up excitement to travel, to go to the pub, and enjoy a beer with a friend, I mean, this sort of thing. We're definitely looking forward to it. Morocco is, where we're at now, it's quite open. Restaurants are opened up, cafes are opened up. The vaccine's going well. In fact, later on today, I have my vaccine appointment. So getting my first jab later on today.
Right. I just had my second jab 2 days ago, so I'm feeling fully protected.
By the end of the month, you and I, we are going to the pub together. We're hanging out in person. This will be great. The last time I saw Richard was actually in Tangier. I saw you. We had a coffee and orange juice down here, right, at the Grand Café de Paris, right? Right across from the French consulate here in Tangier.
Yeah, I really miss it. I'd love to go back there, and I hope to come back to Morocco soon.
In fact, you were kind enough. Yeah, you inscribed a couple of your books here, which is great. So let's maybe start talking about Tangier a tad bit. Why I have you today. One of the things that came up in this book, we were just talking about, was this idea of gaining access. And you're very much interested, I think. And one of the things I enjoy about your writing is you're very much into it. It's not all just book reading and stuff. When you're doing research, you're on the ground. You're attempting to open doors into places. And one of the places you wanted to really go to was Samuel Pepys' house. And I'm going to say that name right now, Samuel Pepys, because I've always said Pepys or Pepys. So Samuel Pepys. So getting access to his house, could you tell us a little bit maybe about that, and maybe another place that you had a interesting time finding access to?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the book is, in a way, it's probably like what you do with your Moon Morocco books and things. It's a guidebook in a way, but it's sort of crossing over different genres. So in some senses, it's a guidebook. And so I hope it's like a set of keys to the city of Tangier, that it will help unlock some of its secrets. So in some sense, it's a guidebook. And in another sense, it's a history book. And the title is, it gives it away, because it's going back to the early ancient prehistory and classical antiquity, right up to the Rolling Stones and the sort of rock and roll era. And I suppose at the very end there's a little epilogue. I don't want to give everything away, but there's a little epilogue about Tangier today. But so it's history, and it's a guidebook, and it's also travel. So I was walking around the city trying to explore its places, and I thought that's a more interesting way of doing history. So each chapter is basically a biography of a famous person that lived in Tangier. And then in order to paint a picture and bring it to life, I didn't want it to just be, in 1352, Ibn Battuta traveled to Mecca or something like that, or the Rolling Stones came in 1968. I didn't want it to just be a chronological dry history. I wanted to bring it alive by describing the places. So people say, how did you write the book? And because I have a family and a job in London, it wouldn't have gone down very well if I had said, oh, see you, honey. I'm going to spend 4 months in Tangier. I'm going to rent a villa with, you know, not a straight man, and I'll see you in 4 months' time. I'll live on the old mountain, or I'll go and hang out with Lucas for 4 months. It'll be fine.
That sounds great. Let's do it.
Yeah. You look after the kids, and everything will be fine, you know. And in fact, a friend of mine said, oh, what you should do is recreate William Burroughs. You and me should go there and take LSD. And I thought, yeah, that sounds great, but we'll think that we're flying and we'll jump off the top of the building and we'll end up dead, or I'll spend 10 years in a Moroccan prison or something, you know, or I'll have permanent brain damage and Parkinson's and stuff. So apart from that, it's a great idea. So I just thought I'll do it more as sort of guerrilla warfare. I'll dip in and out of the country, which was what I did with Marrakesh in the first book. I took EasyJet flights from Gatwick to Marrakesh, and I took flights from, I can't remember, but, you know, I took flights in with Air Arabia, and I went like 5 times in 4 years. Well, pretty much sort of every year, and I go in for like 5 or 6 days and blitz the place and walk around and absorb it as much as I could. But there was a previous book written by Ian Finlayson in the 90s, and he said he spent sort of months staying in a villa on the old mountain. And I'd love to have done that, but unfortunately, that's not how I did it. So it wasn't a sustained campaign; it was guerrilla warfare. And so, very early on, I stayed in the Rembrandt Hotel, and I'd been told that where William Burroughs wrote *Naked Lunch* was this sort of hostel called the Villa Muneria, and it was later called the Villa Delirium because all these people had taken so many drugs and things.
Sure.
And I was told it was sort of near the Rembrandt, but further down the hill towards the port. Yep. And I couldn't quite figure it out. And I've got a terrible sense of direction. Me and my daughter are the same. Like, we're driving, you know, different routes to school, and we end up in sort of the Midlands or something. So I had this problem that I couldn't find the Villa Muneria, and I kept walking around the Rembrandt, and I couldn't figure out. I was Google mapping it. I was looking at physical maps. I was looking out my window. I was looking at the port. And I was walking around and I couldn't find it. And then it was actually more or less in front of my nose. It was like from my window, it was sort of like 400 yards away. But because of the shape of the building and the street, you know, it took me a while to figure out where it was. Then when I eventually did, I knocked on the door and I said, I'm writing a book about Tangier. I'd love to come and explore this hotel. And they said, that's fine, but you can't go into the room where William Burroughs lived. And I said, oh, right, why is that? And they said, well, it's locked, and my uncle has got the key to the room, and my uncle's gone to Gibraltar. And I was like, okay, when will your uncle be back? You know, I sort of along with this. And they said, you know, August or something. And this was in April, you know, and I was like, yeah, right, thanks for that. That's really helpful, you know. So initially, I went onto the balcony at the back and I peered into this room because I was taking notes, you know, we're in this historic hotel where this groundbreaking revolutionary book of American literature was written. And I'm looking through and all I can see is a bed and stuff. And it, you know, anyway. And so I'm exploring more and more of this hotel, and it's pretty run down, but I like that. I like, you know, I like the fact that these places are all a bit chaotic. And then there's this woman downstairs who turns out to be the mother of the man that opened the door. And I'm chatting to her, and she says, oh, what are you doing? And I said, I'm researching this book, you know, and I wanted to get into, I think it's room 9, but I can't remember. But anyway. And she goes, oh, the one where William Burroughs lived. I go, yeah. She goes, oh, yeah, I'll open it. And I'm like, what about the uncle? You know, I was about to say, is the uncle come back from Gibraltar? But I thought, I don't want to buy into that, because they're obviously, they were on different pictures, the mother and the son. So she then lets me into the room, and I'm able to take photos. And she's apologizing, saying, I'm sorry, there's some knickers on the bed, and there's a, you know, some shampoo on whatever, you know. So it was, the family had used it. It wasn't being rented out. So I found this was occurring all the way through, whether it was Samuel Pepys's house or Henri Matisse's room that he painted a famous picture through the window in the Villa de France, and getting into the Cape of Hercules at the beginning. I found there were always obstacles, But in a way that makes for more interesting travel writing. It wouldn't be very interesting if you just said, I turned up and everything was fine. You know, that wouldn't be a very interesting travel book. So, and I was just thinking very briefly, there was another, because I don't want to give I love Tangier, and I don't want to give the impression that it was frustrating all the time, because there were lots of fantastic people and incredibly helpful. But I remember one of my contacts sort of said, oh, you must meet this man who's got a carpet shop in the Medina. He knows Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones. And so I said, great. So again, it was sort of down 3 or 4 alleyways, and it was difficult to find the shop. But eventually I go in, and there's this lovely man, and he gives me a cup of tea, and he says, you must meet my son. And it turns out that his son's from the same part of London as me, and we're all having a fantastic time. And so I get out my tape recorder and I say, oh, is it okay if I interview about your memories of Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones? And he goes, yeah, sure, you know. And he speaks perfect English. And I thought, this is fantastic. This is gold dust, you know. And actually, it was I hope he's not going to watch this, but it was one of the most boring interviews I've ever done, because when I said to him, what's Mick Jagger like? He goes, oh, lovely man, lovely, very nice man, you know. And I'd go, right. So what's he like? You know, very nice. And then this went on for about half an hour. And after about 20 minutes, I just pressed the pause button on the recording machine, because I just realized this wasn't going anywhere. But I didn't want to just leave and say, you know, F off, because he's given me a cup of tea, and we're admiring his shop, and his
very
son's
nice,
coming
yeah.
in. And then we have a selfie together, and I'm putting it up on Instagram, going, one of the great characters of Tangier, you know. And I just was hoping that he'd give me all these fantastic anecdotes. And of course, he just sort of said, very nice man. And I'd go, you know, Keith Richards, very nice man. You know, Brian Jones, very nice man. And I thought, this just isn't working, you know. So as you probably know, you know, nothing is certain in Morocco and everything is possible. So sometimes, you know, something fantastic happens that you had no idea about. And other times you're convinced that you're going to get the money shot, and it doesn't happen, you know. So that, I think that's my experience of Tangier and Morocco generally, you know. But I have faith that, you know, things open up.
Well, you know, you started your piece for the OUR MOROCCO anthology. So your essay, Nothing is Certain, where you talk a little bit about, you know, the writing last storytellers from writing Tangier. And you use that, you know, you use that, nothing is certain, but everything is possible. And then, you know, Mohammed Shukri, the famous Tangier writer from Tangier, he has a little flip on this thing as well, where everything is surreal and everything is possible. But what is it about this kind of phrasing here, particularly in Tangier, that rings true with you? Because that is something you've come back to a few times.
Yeah, I mean, it's just that you can't predict what's going to happen. And so another writer, a Moroccan writer called Lotfi Akalay, I interviewed him, and he had this lovely anecdote, because I said, what do you like about Tangier, and why do you think it's attracted all these writers? And he said, I love it because you never know what's going to happen. And he said, I walk across the road and I don't know what's going to happen. I might run over, or I might meet somebody, or, you know, the world, it'll always be different. And he said that he went to Switzerland once, you know, to give a talk, because he'd written a book about Ibn Battuta. He went to some conference in Geneva, and he said, I stood at the side of the road in Geneva, you know, I pressed on I don't know what you guys call it, but the zebra crossing, you know, the pedestrian crossing. He pressed the button, and it goes from a red standing man to a green walking man. And he said he crossed the road, and he said, I couldn't believe it because the traffic stopped at the traffic light, and I crossed the road. But he said, I found Switzerland really boring because everything worked. But if I cross the road in Tangier, I'm never sure if I'm going to survive or not. So I think that's one of the things that appeals, that it's just so, and it was the same with my first book, that things that I set out to achieve didn't often happen. Some of the storytellers had died, or were not available, or they didn't want to speak to me, or they wanted lots of money. And then others were the kindest men in the world. And, you know, I hope that I managed to restore and retrieve and save some of these stories. And in a way, there's strange sort of parallels between the Tangier book and the Marrakesh book, even though I hadn't intended them to be. I thought they were completely different genres. But in a way, the Tangier book is a collection of stories. And Josh Schumack, who wrote this book called Tangier, A Literary Guide, he was saying that a city isn't just about urban planning and architecture and maps. The cities are constructed by their stories. So in a way, the Tangier book is a collection of stories in the same way that The Last Storytellers is. It's just, in a way, it's a whole collection of anecdotes with some of these amazing characters. But I can't just blurt out lots of stories. So it's structured in terms of history and biographies. And one of the ideas for the book came from, I read this book called Berlin by Rory McLean, and he'd done it in a really interesting way. So it was a quirky history of Berlin chronologically, but including sort of serious people like Bismarck. Then he'd have a chapter on David Bowie, because David Bowie lived in Berlin in the 70s. Well, I think it was the 70s, but anyway. And so I think I got the same idea. I thought I want to include serious people like the Roman general that governed the city, but then I wanted to go to the opposite extreme. So you've got like Kenneth Williams from the British Carry On films and stuff. So it's I think the collection of disparate and weird and wonderful people almost reflects the city itself, because as you probably know more than me, Tangier is a wonderful place, but it's very unpredictable, and it's very, well, it's so culturally vibrant because it's at the crossroads of Europe and Africa and the Middle East, and so it's so rich, and I hope the book sort of reflects that.
Yeah, and do you think we've brought up a few people, and maybe for those tuning in, Tangier has had a rich history, and you cover about 5,000 years, in Tangier of history there, and I think they've recently found artifacts that date people here 25,000 years ago, something like that. It's been for a long time. This area has been a bit of a cradle of civilization type place, and throughout the years, the people that we know here, from Roman generals and kings and queens and all that stuff, to Ibn Battuta, Muhammad Shukri, some people from Tangier, but also the people that come here, from you brought up William Burroughs, Henri Matisse. There's this whole collection of people that have ended up in Tangier as well. So do you think they end up here just because it is such a crossroads of culture and place? I mean, what do you think it is that draws people to Tangier? Because there is almost like a siren call that draws a certain sort of person here.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of accident of history and geography. So actually, when I was researching the book, I bought one of the books I read was called The Great Seas in History, and thought, I hope, well, in a way, I hope there was a chapter on Tangier because it would help my research, and in a way, I hope there wasn't, because I thought I want to sort of create my own mark. So anyway, there was a chapter on Istanbul, and I was reading it the other day. So again, Istanbul is strategically and geographically and historically at this juncture between Asia and Europe. And it's at one end of, that's at the eastern mouth of the Mediterranean. And then Tangier is at the western mouth. But they're similar in that, so great cities are often ports. They're often on the edge of the world, but they're also at junctions, so that they're just, there's this accident of history. And also, as you know, people like Henri Matisse and Delacroix came to Tangier because the light is so exceptionally clear and it brings out the colors. And so the light is bouncing off two seas, the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, so that makes it particularly inspiring for creative people. And so you've got the historical thing, you've got the geographical thing, you've got the light. But in a way, And then you have people like Paul Bowles saying that he felt that underneath the physical buildings of Tangier, there was a sort of subterranean spiritual or a sort of element of sort of witchcraft underneath the surface. Now, obviously, that's not something that you can dig a hole, you can put a measurement down and go, oh, we found witchcraft at 1,000 feet below the level of the. We can't even prove that, but there were people that felt, and even more modern people like Christopher Gibbs, the art and antiques dealer, was saying he felt rhythm of Islam in the city and it appealed to him. And so it's very indefinable, and you can't really nail it what it is. And then another writer, John Hopkins, who documented, he wrote a book called The Tangier Diaries, which was about this era of the 60s. And he was just saying that, well, I interviewed him and he said, oh, you're going to write a book about Tangier. He said, if you ever find out, the answer or the secret of Tangier, you'll be, the first person to ever do that. So, because nobody's ever really found the answer, or there isn't an answer anyway. And he said, actually, people have been too intellectual about, because people say, what attracted all these writers and artists to Tangier? And he just said, oh, it's the drugs and the boys, and maybe the fresh fish. So it's not as complicated as it has to be. It was there at its peak in a literary sense in the 50s and 60s. It was scared for homosexual writers who were not allowed to be homosexuals in Britain or Europe or the United States, and so they came to Morocco. And because it was an international zone, it was a free-for-all, and people could do what they liked. And if you had a bit of money, you could live an extraordinarily nice life. And even, the fresh fish was incredibly nice, and you could go to the beach. So you could have a fantastic life without spending much money, and the weather was good. So there's so many reasons, but you don't always have to intellectualize it too much.
Yeah, and one of my ongoing kind of theses for Morocco in general and Tangier maybe specifically is that for literally, thousands of years, it's been a place for refugees, different sorts of refugees. And I think about that when, we don't think about Islam today in terms of being very open as in terms of, accepting homosexuality and the such, but Morocco, for a long time, even today, it is a place of refuge in some ways for people who are, homosexual and were persecuted throughout Europe. They'd find refuge here. But at the same time, there is, that kind of, for me, it's a little morally dubious. I don't know if you want to speak about this at all, but, there is almost a sense of exploitation in some ways that I'm still kind of coming to terms with as I'm reading a lot and researching a lot. Where there is, there is on one hand, you have this, on the other hand, is there a form of exploitation happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I've struggled with that as well, and I don't have an answer, and maybe that's the best way to approach it. And I gave a talk at a literary festival, actually, it was in Gibraltar, and I was talking about all this fascinating history, and then the period when homosexual writers from America in the 50s came to Tangier. And then someone put their hand up and said, well, what did the Moroccans think of this? And that really threw me because I hadn't really thought about that. And I just sort of waffled about they'd seen it, everyone come and go, and they'd always sort of been quite laissez-faire, and they'd seen their city change. They'd seen it being conquered by Romans and the Spanish and the Visigoths or whatever. And they'd survived. So they were sort of always quite pragmatic about it. But it's not to say that it's okay. And then I listened, there was a radio documentary about 10 years ago about Tangier, and it was called Queer Tangier. And it was by a writer who's based in Britain, who's an expert on Paris and stuff. And he travels around Tangier and he talks to these people. But I don't know if the editors had said, but there were these sort of health warnings throughout this half-an-hour documentary, where he said, of course, paedophilia is wrong, and this kept coming out throughout the documentary. It was sort of like you'd see on a packet of cigarettes, sort of smoking damages your health. Like, yeah, we know paedophilia is wrong. I don't need to flag that up. So I was thinking, it'd be a bit like if you did a documentary or wrote a book about the Middle Ages, and then you said, Henry V married Matilda when she was 12 years old, and you said, and of course, the writer doesn't approve of underage sex. Of course not. That, you don't. It would be weird if I kept pointing this out. So I didn't want to sort of take a stance. I'm just recording documenting what went on. So of course, William Burroughs slept with underage Moroccan men, and so did Joe Orton and people like that. And I'm not saying that's good, and I'm not saying, I just don't think that it's my job to start, because we're in an age where there's a big debate about exploitation, and of course, I'm glad we're having that debate. But I'm not going to be putting our morality onto something that happened, 50 years ago. I'm not condoning it at all, but I'm not condemning it either. I'm just recording what went on, and I think it would be bizarre, because it really jarred in my head with this documentary that said, exploitation of young children is never acceptable. Well, of course it's not. But even when you say that, you're then taking a stance, and then you sort of open up this debate. And in a way, the debate is, I'm not really interested in getting into that sort of, debate.
Yeah, I mean the questions of pedophilia, that's a little bit different in a way than what I'm thinking. Of course, that does exist, that's not only, that's of course heterosexual, homosexual, that has happened throughout history. But I'm thinking more in terms of just strict homosexuality, where even between two grown men or two grown women, you'd have these sort of love affairs, these relationships, and people would find solace in the fact in Tangier that was tolerated. You could have your adult relationships, and you wouldn't have that right in Europe. You wouldn't be able to kind of openly live with your partner, as was the case. I think kind of it goes in the exoticism of Morocco in some ways to talk about Paul, like William Burroughs, and the heroin and the drugs and the boys and the pedophilia and all that. That's there's definitely that happening as well. But on the other hand, there's people that are just want to live their life, I think, and they're trying to find an escape, and they're very much they have a partner or someone that they've been with for years, that they just want to be able to live their life here. And I think Tangier is still a place where people can find that sort of acceptance in a community that they might be lacking at home, which I think is interesting anyway.
I mean, when I sent a copy of my book to a Moroccan woman living in Australia, and she liked the book, and I asked for some feedback, and she said, "Oh, I love the book, but a lot of she said all the Moroccan characters in your book were either shysters or bum boys." And I thought, that's a bit harsh, because I have there's a whole chapter on Mohammed Mrabet, who I much admire as a storyteller. He's like the greatest storyteller, the greatest living storyteller in Morocco. So I'm not reducing him to either of those categories. And then I was only able to write the book with the help of a Moroccan modern writer called Othman Ben Chikroun. And a lot of my book describes my conversations with him and how he helped get into places and stuff. So I have nothing but respect for him. But of course, Joe Orton's diaries just sort of says, or William Burroughs say, "Oh, I went to bed with a guy called Mohammed, and then the next day I met another guy called Mohammed, and I wasn't sure if it was the same one."
The same guy.
Which is, in a way, a terrible thing to say, but in a way, incredibly funny. So I'm just not going to go there, because people say, "Are you condoning this?" And I'm not. But I think you're right about Tangier being a haven, because there's another whole, and something that I've barely touched on, but another whole history is the Jewish history in Morocco.
Yeah.
And after Jews were expelled from Spain, some of these families settled in Morocco and became the merchants and the bankers of Morocco. And that there was a family called the Abensours, and I do mention them a bit. The father or the husband, when after he died, his widow let me have access to his diaries, and it was a fantastic insight into those days, again in the sort of 60s and 70s. And he has a drink with Errol Flynn on his yacht and stuff like that, and accidentally ends up in a porn film. And it's all bizarre, but it's like the diary of a bank manager in Tangier. And but so the Jewish, they were given in many. I mean, it's a very nuanced history, but they were given a haven in Morocco. But then as things got bad again in the '67 war and the creation of Israel, a lot of Jewish people felt unwelcome in Morocco. So it's a nuanced history, and it's not one that I know a lot about. But definitely, I think Tangier has been a haven for people.
And people, a lot of people, just for people's edification, there, as far as we know, there were Jewish people here before the Romans got here, like living around Morocco. So there's actually a long Moroccan, like a Judeo-Moroccan history that we don't have great records of, but we do have some artifacts here and there. And people that are interested in like the Amazigh Berber culture here in Morocco, they can trace a lot of or tie a lot of like things that are important to Judaism that have found their way to Amazigh culture as well, in terms of like, sort of the types of designs they use, the sorts of things that they wear. And that's a whole nother corner of history. But then again, it's a place of refuge. I think it really is. But that said, so Tangier, is it living its heyday? Is it past its heyday? Is it past its prime? Richard, as the expert on all things Tangier, where do you weigh in here?
Well, it's very kind, but I'm not the expert, and it's very much it's a really interesting question. That sounds like I'm dodging the bullet, but it's some people have said the glory days were in the 50s and 60s, and that now you get the sense that the party's over and it's not it's not what it was, And when you talk to some of the older long-term expat residents, they will lament some of these developments happening because, as you know, a lot of investment has gone into Tangier to make it modern and clean up its act and put in new hotels, Hilton and McDonald's and Brand Marina, and it's very exciting in lots of ways. But some of the older residents are going, oh, this is awful, the character of the city is endangered and we're going to lose all this heritage. And there's a very fine balance. But on the other hand, let's not be too nostalgic about things, because times move on and places change, and the history of Tangier is an organic one that has been very fluid, and Tangier has been shaped by successive waves of conquests and civilizations, and that's what makes it fascinating. These layers of history and layers of different cultures, which make it such a cosmopolitan place. So if you said, "Oh, we'd never want to change it all," then it would, it would be pre-Roman or something, and nothing would have changed at all. So I'm excited by change, but at the same time, you've got to admit that the glory days appear to have been this sort of swinging lifestyle in the 50s, when basically Europe and America were perhaps Europe more, but were suffering from a very grey post-Second War. There was rationing, and there was a lot of, it wasn't a very exciting place to live. Tangier was an escape, and there was parties and colour and of course drugs and sex and rock and roll. And you've got people like Barbara Hutton, and that she had the walls of the Medina widened so she could drive her Rolls Royce up into the Casbah and have parties there. And it sounds like a fantastic time. And I don't know what it is about me, but there's probably some psychological condition, but I almost have a nostalgia for a time that existed before I was born, because I wasn't born in the 50s. But I have a sort of yearning for what it must have been like before I was around. And there's a Woody Allen film, and I know, again, Woody Allen, people go, oh, you don't want to go there. But there's a great film called Midnight in Paris.
I was
and
literally just
the
thinking about the same movie. I was literally going to ask you if
right.
you've seen this movie. I was
So it's
exact same movie.
Owen Wilson's in it, and he's going, and they're arguing about when was the golden era of Paris, and all these characters from the past, because it's a sort of surreal, like romantic realism or whatever it's called. It's a weird, surreal film where people travel back in time. But they argue as to whether Paris was better in the times of Hemingway or better at the time of Toulouse-Lautrec, you know, whether it was the fin de siècle or the 1930s or whatever. And in fact, one of the characters says, I have a nostalgia for a time before I was born. And I don't know why I have that. And I'd have to spend many years on a couch to be psychoanalyzed. But I'm interested in, and maybe it was a time, you know, like my parents used to show me old slides of Spain in the 50s and 60s where they used to go when it was very much pre-Benidorm and stuff. So I'm interested in an era before I was around. But in terms of, you know, which is the greatest era and when was the heyday and whether it's, you know, it's very difficult because we don't know what the future holds, and that's quite exciting. And as I say, there is a renaissance in Tangier, as I'm sure you've noticed. And it was neglected under Hassan II and then revived under Mohammed VI. So it's exciting that there's more tourism and there's more things going on.
There is, and although you know, I'm friends with quite a few of the kind of old time, you know, the long time expats here, and you know, a lot of them they enjoy the new energy. You know, there is kind of almost like a new energy kind of being thrown into the city, which I find is, I can't say it's past its heyday, but maybe it is. You know, but there is something else happening here that I think is pretty interesting. So I had a couple of wrap up questions for you. So I was thinking about, you know, you've covered so many of these periods of, you know, the history in Tangier. What is, I guess you already answered it. If there is one period you'd like to live in, it'd be the 1950s, right? That would be the Tangier, like inner zones. It's still the inner zone, the end of the inner zone era.
Yeah, probably. Actually, sorry, something I wanted to mention in my last answer was, you know, this whole question of, do you prefer it now or do you prefer it then, or was it better in the old days? And, you know, you do hear a lot of people saying, oh, it was better in the old days. So one of the people who was very helpful for me was Jonathan Dawson, who's a long-time expat. He came to Tangier, I think, in the 80s. And he was very funny, and he entertained me in his flat, and he's still around, but spends a lot of time in Gibraltar. And he said that he arrived, you know, in the sort of 90s or something. And I said, what drew you to Tangier? And he said, well, I was writing about all the weird freaks in Tangier. And as soon as I got off the plane, I realized I fitted in perfectly. And then at the very end of the book, I said, you know, what do you think? Do you think Tangier is better than it was, or is it worse? And he said, oh, there's a revival, there's a real renaissance. I'm just quoting from, this is the last page of my book. He says, Tangier is having a real renaissance. The money started pouring in after King Mohammed VI arrived here in 1999. But when I first came here, it was dead in the water. There was nothing, no internet, just a bit of television from Gibraltar. And he says, now it's booming, it's on a roll. And then he remembered a time when he went up to the old mountain where you live to visit Marguerite McVey, who was an old character who'd been married to James McVey, and she lived in this beautiful house on the mountain. So Jonathan said to me, I used to go up to her house on the old mountain for lunch, and I would ask her the same question you just asked me. What do you think of Tangier now? Of course, she'd been there since 1930. Well, she looked me straight in the eye and she said, darling, I loved it then and I love it now. And so I think that's a nice sort of way to end the book, and a nice sort of a pithier way to answer your question, which I was floundering around with. But in terms of what's the best time, I sort of weirdly would have liked to have been around in the 50s. And then, sorry, another thing I wanted to mention was there's this wonderful book called Living Tangier that I'd give a plug to by Abdelmajid Hanoum, who's a anthropologist living in the United States. And we swapped books, and we interviewed him for the British Moroccan Society, and he enjoyed my book and I loved his. And his is a completely different side of Tangier. It's about the sort of underworld of street children and migrants, hand to mouth and trying to get into Europe. And I felt sort of rather embarrassed because I had been writing about this glamorous cocktail world of Barbara Hutton and stuff, and had not. And again, it was a bit like the Villa Mineria. It was sitting sort of in front of my nose, and I hadn't noticed it. And I felt guilty in a way that I hadn't documented the lives of migrants and how they're beaten up by the police and street children and all this sort of stuff. But on the other hand, it's like our Morocco. You know, it could be called My Morocco because every chapter is a different person's perspective. So we all have our views and our personal history. And so I'm not, like some people have, like the woman that said, oh, all your Moroccans are about shysters and pompoids. I'm not a Moroccan. So I have to write it from the perspective of a white guy from Britain. And I write what I see, but I feel maybe a bit embarrassed that I didn't go underneath the surface to document the lives of migrants. But luckily, Majid Hanoum has done that, and that's a whole other world.
Yeah, I'll have to pick that up because the only other Moroccan I know that is Mohammed Shukri, who's taken this sort of this kind of Morocco that we typically as foreigners don't have a lot of access to, or we kind of tend to ignore. You know, we don't seek that out, and that is, you know, aspects that are really very much in poverty looking to migrate to Europe, and that's a serious conversation. You know, maybe for another time. Maybe we'll both do a bit of research there, and we'll have a coffee, knock heads that we come together with. But yeah, there is very much that as well. And of course, living here in Tangier, every so often, you know, every few weeks, every few months, you get a story of, you know, a migration gone wrong, you know, where people have passed away. You know, recently, of course, there was the thousands that made the swim into Ceuta, just like last week. You know, I think it was 6,000. I think amazingly, it's still one person died, but one person did die trying to, you know, make that migration, trying to make that swim. You know, and but that's very much a serious conversation. To end on a, I guess, lighter note, if you could sit at Cafe Hoffa. Okay.
You're right, though, that, you know, there's a lot of poverty in Morocco and Tangier, and I do, to sort of defend myself a little bit, I do write about Mohammed Mrabit's childhood, which was pretty deprived, and then Mohammed Shukri as well. You know, he wrote For Bread Alone, and so I do try to sort of explore that it's not just all about expats having champagne and having a laugh and the sort of playground for the rich. I do explore some other parts of the city, but I just feel that, you know, the whole migrant, I didn't delve into it in my book. But on the other hand, I start by saying at the beginning of the book that the history of Tangier is about migration, and it's about exile, and it's about people coming and going. But there are lots of people that go, oh, the chapters are all about foreigners. So again, I sort of have to defend myself.
Oh, it's not.
But Tangier's history is molded by outsiders, and it's almost the ultimate place of the outsider, which appeals to me. You know, it's not a sort of mainstream place, and its identity has been shaped by people coming from outside, and it has that sense of otherness. So I think it's just a fascinating place.
Yeah, no, I mean, it truly is. It truly is. And of this fascinating place, of all these fascinating characters, if you could, right now, today, it's a wonderful day, a little bit of a wind today, but it's really quite nice, very comfortable, a little sunny outside. If you could go to Cafe Hoffa and sit down and have a mint tea and spend about an hour chatting with anybody from the history of Tangier, who would this person be?
I mean, that's a great question, and it's like a bit like that Desert Island Discs, where people say, if you could take one book to a desert island, what would it be? And people try and get around it by saying, can I take a subscription to Audible or something? You know, And so in a way, I'd love to say I'd like to have a round table discussion with 6 people from 6 different eras. But there's one character who's not, I don't dedicate a chapter to him, but he turns up in the chapter on Joe Orton, who was a British playwright. And so he used to hang out in a place called the Windmill, which was down a cafe down on the beach. But with all the developments, the Windmill and other sort of seedier nightclubby places got bulldozed. But they put these places underneath. Well,
it's under the boardwalk now. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's sort of more discreet, so that you're not sort of confronted by it. So the Windmill, Joe Orton used to go there and sort of flirt with young Moroccan boys. And Kenneth Williams, who starred in the Carry On films, who's I think one of the reasons why I like writing this book was it sort of, apart from an era before I was born, it also reconnected me with people that, like the Rolling Stones. I was a big fan of the Stones when I was a teenager, and so I really enjoyed writing about Brian Jones and discovering more about the Stones. And I got in touch with a photographer who documented their lives, and so and this isn't very highbrow, because I'd like to say I read Tolstoy when I was 12, but actually when I was that age I watched a lot of Carry On films, and they're terrible, and there's cheap sexual innuendo and terrible jokes and people blacking up and anti-gay jokes, and they're terrible films, and they were made on a budget, but I find them hysterical. And so Kenneth Williams was the master of innuendo, and his diaries talks about his holidays in Tangier. And so one of the anecdotes was that he would, and if I was sitting in the cafe Haffa with a cup of mint tea listening to him, it would be the blue sky and the white terrace of the cafe, and then him telling this anecdote, which was, so I'm mentioning that the book is all about me trying to get into places. And in a way, this anecdote is about someone trying to get in. So again, it was in this heyday of the sort of Barbara Hutton days and David Herbert, and the house that you live in now belongs to him. That there were all these people having a very expensive, wonderful time in a fancy dress party. And so this guest goes up to the door, dressed as the Queen Mother, and knocks on the door. And the butler of this beautiful house in the Casbah or the Medina or whatever opens the door and says, "You can't come in. She's here already." So I love that story, and that's so that's very Tangier, as they say, so Tangier. And then quickly, Samuel Pepys's house. But in one area, it was owned by this man, a British artist, painter called Jim Wiley. And he would answer the door, and people would go, "Is Jim Wiley there?" And he would put a mask on and go, "Jim Wiley can't come to the door because he's gone mad." And one of the sort of themes running through the book is this sort of sense of madness and delusion, because Francis of Assisi, or in Latin, I'm not going to say it in Latin, but he said Tangier was a city of madness and delusion. And so, and I like that. And in a way, that's literally, he was prescient, Francis of Assisi, because in the 50s and 60s, some of these writers like William Burroughs were experimenting, and Brian Gyson, I haven't had a chance.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a whole chapter on him and his wonderful, weird mishaps. And so they literally drove themselves mad by taking drugs. And also Tangier, in a way, and Morocco can drive you a bit mad, because it can be very frustrating, as I said. But there's also moments of great beauty and elation. So I don't want people to think that the book's all about creation, because that it's much more than that. But those are some of my.
Honestly, Richard, congratulations! It's a wonderful read. I mean, honestly, this has been one of my favorite reads over the last couple of years. Speaking of Henri Matisse, you got some photos and some clips in here. I mean, it's really, really wonderful. I can't wait till you can make it back to the Villa Harris, though. They've done this lovely. So
heard great things about that.
Lovely. Yeah. So Well, we can't wait to welcome you back to Tangier. So yeah, hopefully we'll be all vaccinated, hanging out in person very soon. But thanks for joining us so much today. I really, really do appreciate it. And then for all of you guys out there, do yourself a favor, pick up Tangier, pick up The Last Storytellers. If you have a copy of OUR MOROCCO, pick up OUR MOROCCO, do a little armchair traveling before we're able to really get out there.
Or come with you and come and visit Morocco, because Morocco needs tourism, and it's had a difficult time, and it will welcome you back with open arms. So I can't wait to go back. And thank you so much for having me, Lucas. It's great to relive some of these memories. I can't wait to come and visit Tangier and see your beautiful house.
Hope so. Very soon. Yeah, we'll come out here. We'll have coffee. We'll have a glass of little wine or something like that. It'll be lovely. Hey, Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.